Hello, I want to go over today's lesson. This is lesson 2 of Unit 3. And today's learning goal was let's write expressions to represent multiplication of unit fractions. So again, we're finding a fraction of a fraction. So the very first thing that students saw when they walked in today was a picture of these 4 diagrams. And they were challenged to come up with at least one reason why each of the 4 diagrams stood out or didn't belong with the rest. So, for example, several students noticed that in diagram A, the number of partitions is 10, while the number of partitions in A, C, and D are 6. And this brought up an interesting point because in diagram A and C, it's easy to see that there are 6 partitions. Each whole has been divided into 6 equal parts. But for D, that's not as explicit. Instead, there are 3 partitioned areas that are equal, and there's a larger area that has not been partitioned. But many students recognized that we could partition this half of the whole just like this side of the whole was partitioned. And so that would mean that this piece here was 1/6. So many students recognized, for instance, that A, C, and D represented a quantity with a denominator of 6, whereas B represents a quantity with a denominator of 10. And so students spent time writing different reasons why each diagram stood out or was different from the rest or didn't belong with the rest. And then students shared their thinking and ideas with each other, and then we shared out as a whole group. So the meat of the lesson really began with these 2 diagrams here, and students were challenged to first show 1/3 of this square, and then to show 1/4 of that 1/3 piece, and determine then what the size of that piece would be, or what the product of 1/4 multiplied by 1/3 would be. And after they did that, they were challenged to show 1/4 of this square and then shade 1/3 of a fourth. And after they worked on that, they were asked to think about how both diagrams were similar and also how they were different. So partitioning or showing 1/3 of this whole, we are going to divide this whole into 3 equal groups. And of course, I'm not exactly partitioning each of these thirds perfectly here, but it gives an idea of what 1/3 would look like. And what's cool about this is in our last unit, students were thinking of fractions as division and vice versa. And this is a nice visual representation of that. 1/3 is the same as 1 divided by 3. And that's exactly what we did here. We took a whole represented by the entire square, and then we divided it into 3 equal groups. So students are building on what they've already seen and worked on in the past to apply to a new concept. So now that I've shown 1/3 of the square, I need to find 1/4 of that 1/3. So to do that, I would need to partition or divide this 1/3 into 4 equally sized pieces. And then since we're only concerned with 1/4 of that 1/3, I'm going to shade over one piece here. So this piece right here represents this shaded portion. And so how much of the whole square is shaded? So students have had some experiences the last couple of days that have helped them to pretty quickly see that it would take 12 of these equally sized pieces that's represented here to make up the entire square. And by extending these partitioning lines across our original 3 partitions here, we can see for ourselves that there are 1, 2, 3 by 1, 2, 3, 4 or 12 equally sized pieces. So that tells us that our denominator is going to be 12, and then since we are only concerned with 1/4 of this third, the denominator would be, or the numerator would be 1. So in other words, 1/4 times 1/3 equals 1/12. And this is what the learning goal is all about, is taking a look at a situation, using a diagram to then create a matching multiplication expression. All right, so the second task here asks us to show first 1/4 of the square here, and I'll try to do a better job with my lines here. So we've partitioned this square into 4 equal sections, and now we want to find 1/3 of 1/4. So one of these sections represents 1/4 of the whole, and then we'd want to partition this 1/4 into 3 equal pieces to represent 1/3 of that 1/4. And if we shade one of those pieces in, we've just shown 1/3 of 1/4 of the whole square here. And again, either mentally or as I'm doing here, graphically representing the size of this piece compared to the whole, by partitioning the entire whole, we can see that the value of this shaded area is also equal to 1/12, and that shows us that 1/3 times 1/4 is also equal to 1/4. And so when students were asked, okay, we've created our diagrams, we've determined that the product is 1/12 in both, what's the same? And students were really quick to point out, well, they're basically the same thing because our factors in both situations or both expressions are the same. They're just in a different order. And so when students were asked, how are these diagrams different? A lot of students didn't really think they were different. They were pretty convinced that they're basically the same thing. And so they were correct in identifying that both diagrams were really just 2 different ways to solve the same problem. But if we were going to explicitly identify a major difference between the two, we started in the first diagram by first showing 1/3 of the square. And then we found 1/4 of that third. Whereas in the next diagram, we did the opposite. First, we showed a fourth of the square and then found a third of that fourth. And this is a subtle difference because ultimately we end up with the same product. And so this was a nice review of the commutative property of multiplication. But this was the first time that students have seen that with a fraction being multiplied by another fraction. So what I mean by the commutative property of multiplication is 2 multiplied by 3, which gives us the product 6, is equivalent to 3 multiplied by 2. And so students recognize that the same property that applies to whole number factors is also applicable to fraction factors. So that was a nice review. And so we were able to connect a lot of previous learning to this activity. Now, the next portion of the lesson is, again, honing in on being able to connect a diagram to a expression. So in this case, we're provided with this diagram here, and we're told that this diagram represents 1/5 multiplied by 1/2. And students worked together to try to figure out where in the figure they saw 1/2 and where in the figure they saw 1/5 of that 1/2. And many students were quick to recognize, even before that the product here is 1 piece out of 10. So they knew that because the diagram represents 1/10, they knew then that the product of 1/5 and 1/2 is equal to 1/10. But kind of working backwards from that fact, they were able to recognize that because this piece here is equal to the other pieces in this row, that helped them to see that these pieces here were 1/5 of half. And so several students went up to the board and helped make that understanding more visual and more apparent to the rest of the class. Now, the next step was taking away the expression and left only with a diagram, and then be tasked with writing the multiplication expression that represents this diagram. And again, a lot of students were more interested in determining the area's value, the shaded area's value, before figuring out the two fraction factors. And that's a totally valid strategy. So a lot of students recognize, okay, this is 1 piece shaded out of 15 equal pieces. So I know the product here is going to be 1/15. Now the challenge is to figure out what my two fraction factors are. And so students, again, work together to try to determine what those two fraction factors would be. If we look at this diagram from a vertical and then horizontal perspective, it becomes more clear what two fractions are actually being multiplied here. You can start from a vertical perspective and then consider a horizontal perspective, or vice versa. And again, that relates back to the commutative property. It doesn't matter which fraction we identify first in our expression. So, starting from a vertical perspective, I noticed that the whole has been divided by 3 here. So the 3 whole columns make up this whole. So I know that one of these columns is 1/3, and thus 1/3 is one of the fraction factors. Now, when I look at this diagram from a horizontal perspective, I can see that each third or each column has been partitioned into 5 equal pieces or areas. And so that indicates to me that the other factor is 1/5. So we found 1/5 of 1/3, or 1/3 of 1/5, depending on how you perceive this diagram here. And so students were happy to determine that 1/3 of 1/5 does equal 1/15, because for a lot of them, 1/15 was the starting point. They kind of started at the end and worked backwards to figure out what the whole expression was equal to. And again, the last part here is just to identify how much of the whole square is shaded, and 1/15 of the whole square is shaded. So after we worked together in groups and in pairs and as a whole class on these different activities, the last thing students were asked to do, and this was their cool down or their exit ticket. So this was something that they were doing individually, and this is a way for me to check to see where their understanding level is, whether they're getting there or whether they've got it and it makes sense to them, or whether they're still confused about the concepts being talked about and worked on. But anyway, they were just given this diagram here, and they had to create a multiplication expression to represent the area of the shaded region. And so, students either determined that 1/4 of 1/2 was being represented here. So, in other words, 1/4 multiplied by 1/2, or they saw horizontally, they saw fourths, and then they saw 1/2 of a fourth, and so in that case, they'd be multiplying 1/2 by a fourth, or finding 1/2 of a fourth, and in each case, obviously the product would be the same, because we are just rearranging the factors here, but many of the students went beyond just writing a multiplication expression. They also identified that the product was 1/8, because it would take 8 of these equally sized areas to make up the whole here. So I hope that this video helps. We are working on multiplying fractions by fractions, finding a fraction of a fraction, or a part of a fraction. And if you have any questions at all, please message me on Remind, or email me. If you have questions about tutoring, if you have questions about graded work, what assignments are due, anything like that, please feel free to contact me. I hope this video helps, and I appreciate you watching.